So the African demographic profile has happened because of two things. Number one, the world is sufficiently globalized, and China has been sufficiently hungry that they will pay anything for raw materials, that all of Africa, not just sub-Saharan Africa, has been able to export raw commodities that are industrial and import food. And that has allowed the populations to expand significantly. So Egypt today, if all of a sudden food imports were no longer an option, they would lose half their population. Even if they converted all their citrus and all of their cotton to wheat, they now have twice the population that's necessary, or twice double the population that their land could support if they just switched over to wheat. And no one in Africa is that extreme, but they're all kind of flavors of that trend. Number two, part of the reason that countries, as they industrialize for the early decades, actually get a much larger population is child mortality goes down significantly. In the case of Africa, that's not because they have gotten better at it. That's because they've been able to afford the technology that they import in terms of things like antibiotics and child care stuff. In a post-globalized environment, the food imports and those technologies go away, and you would expect to see population crashes. Maybe not as dramatic as what I'm expecting to see in China, but still horrific. The second problem is that Africa is a series of 5 stacked plateaus, and it's very difficult to get physical infrastructure up and down those plateaus. So in the colonial era, the Europeans never tried. They built tap lines to a specific economic resource, typically a mine, and that was it. And the Africans have discovered that the cost of building a real transport network is just too onerous, and the benefits from it are too thin, so it just really hasn't happened at scale outside of South Africa. That makes it very hard for them to benefit in a post-globalized system. They'll still have those tap lines, they'll still have the resources that the world needs, and I don't think we're going to have a
raw commodities, though.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to have a new colonial era because, just because they're going to see higher expenses and higher death rates doesn't mean that all of a sudden all the guns are going to go away. I mean, part of the reasons why the colonial era was so horrible for the Africans is the Europeans brought guns to knife fights for decades. Well, Africans' guns might not be as good as European guns, but they're still guns. And so the delta isn't there anymore. But that doesn't mean I think they're going to do great. So there's pockets. Kenya, Uganda, South Africa, Nigeria, Senegal, where the infrastructure is easier to build. I think they'll do better. Then you get your third thing, and that's HIV. The birth rates, the survivability of the youth in Africa in the HIV countries has basically dropped by more than half. And yes, they are now getting better at prevention, but that takes a massive melon scoop out of their demographic structure that is irreplaceable.
How positive are you on America's future?
Well, let's start with the basics that most countries kind of lack. The United States and Canada are 2 of the world's greatest agricultural producers and massive exporters. Check, that's not going anywhere. The North American system can provide for its own input system for agriculture, so it's not going to go anywhere at all. Canada and the United States are 2 of the world's largest energy producers and processors. That's not going anywhere. So already the basics of civilization look pretty good. We've got ocean moats. We don't have to worry about an invasion. Check. Our demographics. The United States is the healthiest demography in the advanced industrial world. Mexico is the healthiest demography in its peer class. And Canada has the best record in the world, bar none, for attracting people in their 20s and 30s via immigration. Those 3 together make North America by far the best demographic picture on the planet. So our capital structure is more or less stable. Our consumption base is fine. Our weakness is in manufacturing. Now, because of the shale revolution, the United States is very good at low-end manufacturing. Heavy chemicals, plastics, that sort of thing, because we have the cheapest inputs in the world. We're also, because of our educational system, the best at the high end. That's where Canada competes, and not well. In the middle are the Mexicans. Everything from heavy machinery to automotive, they excel. So the challenge moving forward is the other stuff. The stuff that we've largely farmed out to East Asia. On the low end, the materials processing, that's primarily a China story. I'm really not worried about the long-term picture. Because we're talking about, when you want to turn lithium into metal or bauxite into aluminum, this is 1920s technology. This is not hard. It's not even very expensive. You just have to take the time to build and site the industrial plant. And you don't do that overnight. So it's probably going to take a shortage to force us to do it, but it would already be far more cost effective to do it on the US Gulf Coast than it is in China. So I'm not too worried there. I'm worried about electronics. Electronics, computing, cell phones, that sort of thing. The thing with electronics is there are so many pieces of different quality sets that require different labor forces, some of which earn $1 a day, some of which earn $1 a second, in close proximity. So in North America, particularly on the Texas-Mexican border, your average car, the pieces are crossing It's 5 and 6 times
Right.
before you get your finished vehicle. That's an industry where we found a way to make it work. Electronics is a lot more complicated than automotive. And the disconnect, the delta between the low end and the high end labor required is much bigger. And so you need the Japan, Korea, Taiwan, China, Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand. You need all of them to do it at scale. That's going away. The only place in North America where we even theoretically could do that is the US-Mexico border region. And maybe if we loop in Colombia for the really low-end stuff, it's not a natural fit like Southeast Asia is. And so that is going to be the biggest adjustment for us, is how to build electronics at scale without that sort of differentiated labor system. And I do not see many opportunities for Canada to play in that space at all, because the Canadian border is with the United States, which is a similar labor structure.
Right. Let's talk about Canada-US for a moment here. You know, one of the most successful relationships, I would say maybe the most successful relationship between any two countries anywhere. But there's something that Canadians notice about every American president, regardless of stripe, which is, including President Biden very recently, sort of supercharging a little bit more Buy American. You know, is there a way through that for Canada?
Honestly, the hard work is done. So, and the person you have to think about this is Donald Trump, which I know, I can see you breaking out into hives already. One of the many clauses about NAFTA 2, I mean, let me start out. I am not a fan of Trump in any way, shape, or form, but I thought NAFTA 2, the way it was done, how it was done, when it was done, was beautifully done. I realize that
It's
there are a lot of
largely
people
viewed very positively in the business community of Canada, too.
I mean, you guys lost a lot of your perks from NAFTA 1, and let's be honest, it was time. But part of it is that the rules of origin laws, especially when it comes to things like automotive, are pretty strict. And that's really, really bad for any automaker in the world who is not in NAFTA. Now, I think the best way that Canada can leverage this is in processing, and this is specifically Alberta. You've got the land, you've got the green space, and especially in Alberta, you've got the cheap electricity and the cheap energy. And that is the big hole that we have in the midterm. Now, the Gulf Coast is going to do everything it can to dominate this, but there's plenty of room for materials processing in Alberta, and I think you really need to take advantage of that. Beyond that, if you want to go into manufacturing, I'm not sure automotive is the greatest place for you to compete overall, because you don't have proximate centers to synergize with. But the more advanced components, the ones that are very high value added, the ones where transport is a minuscule, if not a rounding error to zero, part of the value, basically, if the part can be flown to its assembly location in an economically viable manner, that's where you can play. I'm not sure you can do that in automotives or EVs, but I bet you can do that in aerospace and electronics.
Do you think that there's a role that Canada could play as sort of a middle power in the world to come?
There was a joke that went around American political circles in the 90s that with the end of the Cold War, New Zealand joined the non-aligned movement and Canada just became an NGO.
I haven't heard that one, but I understand it.
Even if Canada could function as a normal, unified, federal or unitary system, and it can't. Even if it could. The shape of Canada, the size of Canada, the fact that it has an Atlantic and a Pacific frontage that are so separated economically, strategically, and culturally, you couldn't play. Because if you can't provide the base security, none of the rest of it works. Now, post-World War II, pre-Ukraine Canadian policy piggybacked on global safety to push development goals and economic development and trade access. And in that you were a middle power, but it was because of an environment that you could not create or shape. That environment is now gone, and so you would have to create or shape it yourself. You don't have the capacity. You're too far away, you're too split, you're too small. I'd argue the United States doesn't have that capacity to do it at scale on a global basis.
Wow.
We are going to have to choose. Now, the fact that Japan has decided to fuse with American power is a huge step in helping that work in different areas. But I think Southeast Asia,
power.
I think Southeast Asia, Northern Europe, specifically Scandinavia, again in partnership with the Brits, and maybe a degree of the Western Hemisphere in general, I think that's what we are going to be limited to. So within that pond, Canada can do a lot, but in addition to making friends with Washington, I would make friends with Tokyo, because if you're looking for something that's a little bit not the United States, that's really the only option on deck until such time as the Brits kind of finally figure out what Brexit means.
If you're advising the Prime Minister of Canada, if you don't think we can play as a middle power, how do you think we should play?
Every Canadian province trades more with the United States than it does with the rest of the world. That will not change this century. I realize that the primary Canadian cultural identifier is that we're not American. Get it? I understand it.
Even though like 80% of us live, within a
within
2-hour drive
sight of the border. Yeah. I would say that the best way, if the goal is to maintain a little bit of light between the United States and Canada, and I understand why that is, the only place you can play is finance. Your energy goes south, your food processing largely goes through American ports. There's really not another player here, and your trade is dependent on American security. But there's a lot of money that's really scared from the rest of the world that is looking for a place to call home. And until recently, all of it that comes to Canada has been going into housing, and you need to redirect that somewhere else.
Right.
So,
huge housing affordability issues in Canada at the moment. Yeah.
Now,
particularly in our gateway cities. Yeah.
The foreigners who are doing this, they're scared. They're going to lose everything. And it's a reasonable fear. And they would prefer a hard asset, a rate of return, and an implicit government guarantee, and housing checks 2 of the 3 boxes. So your goal is to create a financial product that checks 3 boxes. Called a community development bond. We're moving into an environment where capital is going to be harder to get. And if you can find a way to funnel stupid, scared capital into more productive uses, that will make Canada awash with foreign money that doesn't really care what its rate of return is. Because if they get half of it back after 10 years, that means they got half their money out. They call that a win.
Better than zero.
Exactly. Yeah. So if you can get the foreigners to pay for your own system, that's the way forward here. And that is the big outsized win for Canada to become, I don't want to call them money launderers to the stars or anything like that.
No, I don't think that should be the tagline.
Yeah, exactly. Right. But you could put it to more productive use than it can if it just goes into housing.
Which is about inflation. Because, if we were to survey, in fact, we regularly do, the folks that live in Alberta and Calgary and Canada, I can tell you what's coming up at the top of their concern list. It's affordability, particularly inflation, and how interest rates interact with that as well. Now, there's this feeling of hopefulness that perhaps the period of inflation is mostly behind us, the pain is mostly behind us, and the interest rates will start to come down relatively rapidly. Do you share that view?
No. In the United States, we're not going to see rates come down for another decade. We have to wait for another generation to become capital rich. Those will be the millennials. Basically, what's happening in the United States is the boomers are retiring. They're taking all their money with them. And even if interest rates were able to come down, capital costs really wouldn't. We have to wait for more people to enter their 50s. That means 2030 to 2035 is when we see the break. Canada's inflation is coming from 2 sources. Number one is the property market. There's no reason to expect that to get better except for this ban on foreign purchases. The foreigners are going to find more and more creative ways to get around that, and so the policy will have to continually be updated to keep that under control. But the second reason you've been dealing with inflationary issues is COVID. From the point that a demand profile shifts, whether it's because of a lockdown or a new vaccine makes it impossible to open, or the anti-vaxxers throw a fit, or the anti-vaxxers all get put in prison, whatever it happens to be. It takes about 18 months for the supply chains to match the new demand profile. And in the United States and Canada, it was 18 months ago that we started our opening. So we're finally getting to the end of the COVID impact. And so yes, you're seeing disinflation now as the supply chains are finally repaired. What I see coming is disruptions that are far more serious, not in demand, but in supply. Materials out of Russia, energy out of Russia, finished goods out of China. All of this is going to hit us over the next few years.
And typically supply-driven inflation is way harder to
Much
address.
harder to fix, because you have to build fundamentally new industrial plant in different locations or rebuild them from the ground up. Now, we will do that in North America. We will double the size of the industrial plant, but it will take us 5 years. And in that 5-year period, we will have inflation of 9 to 15% per annum. But it's not because we don't have stuff. It's because we're building the ability to have stuff. And it will be rampant economic growth to be paired with that inflation. So it'll hurt, but at the end of it, we will have a supply chain system that is simpler, cleaner, more energy efficient, that employs people on the continent to sell people to the continent, that is immune to things that happen beyond the continent. This is a good story, but it's not a straight line, and it is bumpy.